I have spent 42 standard cycles cataloging incident reports from training facilities across the Galactic Defense Consortium. I have read accounts of heroism so extreme they strain credibility. I have filed documentation on disasters so catastrophic they changed military policy across 14 systems. I have processed enough trauma narratives to fill the memory banks of a small moon. Nothing in those 42 cycles prepared me for the file that landed on my desk 3 years ago under the mundane heading. Anomalous behavior observed, Crucible Station Verk 9, Deathworld Circuit. When I first opened it, I assumed it was misfiled, perhaps a satirical submission, an intern's attempt at humor. The incident summary read verbatim: Subject human male designation specialist Marcus when completed phase 1 of Deathworld Circuit. Upon exit, subject located personal food storage container, sat on exterior ground and consumed midday meal. Duration, approximately 22 minutes. No medical intervention required. No trauma response observed. Subject requested additional water. I read it 3 times. Then I requested all supplementary materials, witness statements, biometric readouts, security footage transcripts, medical observations, and anything else associated with incident file GDC HFY 7741 Delta. What follows is the reconstructed account of what happened on Crucible Station Verk 9, on the 77th day of Galactic Cycle 4409. When one human being sat down in the dirt outside the most punishing military training environment ever designed, opened a small metal container, and ate his lunch. It sounds like nothing. It was, in fact, everything. Part 1: What the Crucible Was. Reconstructed from GDC Training Facility Design Documents. Cycles 4280, 4401. Before we can understand what happened that day, you need to understand what the Crucible actually was. Not what the recruitment brochures said it was. Not what the propaganda reels showed when the GDC wanted to impress the Senate subcommittees. What it actually was, which was considerably less glamorous and considerably more terrifying. Crucible Station Verk 9 had been operational for 129 standard cycles by the time Specialist Marcus arrived. It had been designed, rebuilt, expanded, and re-engineered 11 times during that period, each expansion triggered by the same recurring problem. The species being trained kept adapting to it. The Crucible, as the engineers like to say, needed to stay harder than the hardest trainee. The original design had been relatively straightforward for a facility of its type. Gravity manipulation chambers, atmospheric variable zones, temperature extremes calibrated to the outer edges of biological tolerance for participating species. Predator simulation drones that could replicate the hunting behavior of 47 documented apex predators. Psychological stress protocols drawing on recorded fear response data from across the galactic community. By Cycle 4280, the Vreth delegation had largely conquered it. The Vreth, a species from a high-gravity, high-toxin world with redundant organ systems and a collective pain tolerance that made medical officers wince, had simply walked through the original design and emerged on the other side looking mildly inconvenienced. The engineers rebuilt, added nitrogen atmosphere burst chambers, added sonic disorientation corridors calibrated to Vreth auditory ranges, added temperature cycling that could shift 60 degrees in under 3 seconds. The Vreth adapted again. This pattern repeated for 11 iterations across a century and a quarter. New species joined the GDC Military Training Consortium. New biological capacities presented new challenges. The Crucible grew. It became, by the time we reached Cycle 4409, something that no single document could fully describe, because no single observer could survive all of it long enough to observe all of it. What the design team had ultimately created was not a training facility in any conventional sense. It was an ecosystem of sustained suffering. The Deathworld circuit, the specific course relevant to this account, was Phase 1 of the advanced track. It was not the worst the Crucible could offer. I want to be clear about that because it matters. What Marcus Wen experienced on that day was not the maximum. It was the entry point. The Deathworld circuit had been specifically named and designed in response to a growing body of research on what was called Deathworld species, a classification the GDC's Xenobiological Department had created somewhat reluctantly after encountering repeated evidence that certain species from high lethality origin worlds demonstrated physiological and psychological profiles so extreme they required separate consideration. Humans had been classified as Deathworld species in Cycle 4387. It had taken longer than it should have. This was partly because humans did not look like Deathworld species. The classification had initially been assigned to the Vreth, the Koron, the Silthari, and 5 other species with immediately obvious physical adaptations, redundant organs, reinforced skeletal structures, extreme regenerative capacity, visible biological armor. Humans looked soft. They looked fragile. Every physiological scan confirmed they were, by the numbers, among the least physically imposing species in the GDC. The reclassification happened after an incident in Cycle 4385 that I won't detail here, except to say that it involved a human fire team, a compromised life support system, a 46-hour siege situation, and the fact that all 7 members of that fire team walked out under their own power when it was over. 3 of them asked about their next assignment before the medics had finished scanning them. The Deathworld circuit had been specifically redesigned in Cycle 4402 to properly challenge Deathworld-class species. It ran for approximately 9 hours of continuous operation. It included 17 gravity shift chambers, cycling between 0.3 G and 4.1 G in unpredictable patterns. Atmospheric environments replicating 6 documented hostile atmospheres, including partial methane, reduced oxygen at 12% concentration, and high particulate air dense enough to limit visibility to approximately 2 meters. Temperature corridors ranging from -41 degrees Celsius to +67 degrees Celsius, with no transition buffer between zones. Predator drone arrays running protocols designed specifically around known human fear response triggers, dark environments, enclosed spaces, pursuit from behind, peripheral movement. 3 psychological pressure sequences, using individualized stress data compiled from each trainee's intake assessment. And a final section, informally called the drag, which was a 2.4-kilometer distance run through a gravity-heavy mud corridor while carrying a weighted pack equivalent to 60% of the trainee's body weight, with drone harassment running continuously. The average completion time for Deathworld circuit across all species was 11 hours 14 minutes. The failure rate, defined as incapacitation, medical extraction, or voluntary withdrawal, was 34% on the first attempt. The average recovery time after completion, for those who finished, was between 2 and 4 standard days. I am providing this context because I need you to understand the weight of what happened afterward. When Marcus Wen sat down in the dirt outside the Deathworld circuit exit gate and opened his lunch, it was not a small thing made into a big thing by the way this report tells it. It was an enormous thing that nobody knew how to talk about at the time. Part 2, Arrival, as remembered by the people who were there. Witness account, Cadet Irvin Salax, Krathi Defense Force, Intake Batch 7741. Recorded interview, GDC Archive Unit, 16 months post-incident. You want me to start at the beginning? Okay, I can do that. I arrived at Verk 9 on the 3rd day of the intake cycle. Most of Batch 7741 was already there, maybe 60 of us altogether, pulled from 11 different species, ranging from first-cycle recruits like me to veterans who were doing advanced qualification for specialized roles. It was a mixed group in a way that made the logistics officers visibly tired just looking at us. Different atmospheric requirements, different gravity tolerances, different dietary needs. The station had been running its intake adaptation protocol for days before we got there, calibrating the common areas to something that could sustain everyone at the same time without killing anyone by accident. I noticed the human on the second morning of orientation. I noticed him because I almost walked into him. He was standing in the corridor outside the mess hall at a time when the corridor was technically empty between meal rotations, when most people were either still in their quarters or doing the mandatory pre-assessment stretching in the exercise bays. He was standing very still, looking at one of the wall panels where the Deathworld circuit overview diagram was posted, just standing there, reading it, not touching anything, not talking to anyone. My species, the Krathi, we are not particularly given to initiating conversation with strangers. It goes against a social instinct that survived several thousand years of our evolutionary history. But something about the way he was looking at that diagram made me stop. He wasn't looking at it with the expression that most people had when they looked at the Deathworld circuit overview. Most of us looked at it the way you look at a medical procedure you know you have to undergo. A kind of grim acceptance overlaid with very sincere hope that it would be over quickly and without permanent damage. He was looking at it like it was a menu. Not literally. I don't mean his expression was cheerful or excited. It was more thoughtful, the way someone looks at a puzzle they're deciding how to approach, tilted head, slight frown but not a worried frown, more like a concentrating frown. I said something. I don't remember exactly what, some version of first time through the circuit, the standard opener for strangers at Werk 9. He looked over at me. He had an unremarkable face for human. Brown skin, dark eyes, average height for his species, which put him on the shorter end of the species assembled in batch 7741. He was wearing the standard issue gray training kit that everyone had been given, no modifications, no unit insignia. He'd been in the GDC longer than me. His rank tab said specialist, which put him a tier above where I was, but he wasn't wearing it in a way that broadcast seniority. He said third time. And then he went back to looking at the diagram. I stood there for a second, not sure what to do with that. Third time through Deathworld circuit. I knew, in an abstract way, that repeat completion existed as a category. Some specialists came back for qualification refreshers, or to test newly developed techniques, or simply because their commanding officers sent them. But I had not met anyone who had done it twice, let alone was preparing for a third run. I said something along the lines of, "Is it as bad as it looks?" He didn't answer right away. He kept looking at the diagram for another moment. Then he said, "It's pretty bad. The drag is the part most people miscalculate. You should eat something heavy beforehand. The gravity cycling in the first chambers is brutal on an empty stomach." Then he pushed off from the wall and walked toward the mess hall, and that was the end of the conversation. I thought about what he said for a long time afterward. Not because the advice was mysterious. It was practical, sensible, and turned out to be completely accurate. I made the mistake of going into the circuit underfueled on my first attempt and paid for it in the gravity chambers in ways that I still don't entirely enjoy remembering. No, I thought about it because of the way he delivered it. The same tone you'd use to describe a moderately annoying commute. It's pretty bad. Like bad was a familiar neighborhood he'd passed through before and expected to pass through again and had no particular feelings about. That was my first real data point on Marcus Wen. I collected more over the following days. Supplementary account, Logistics Sergeant Prita Voss, Werk 9 Station Staff, Kratha Human Joint Assignment. Written statement submitted to Archive Unit, 12 months post-incident. I processed the intake documentation for batch 7741. My job was to cross-reference dietary requirements, atmospheric accommodations, personal equipment authorizations, and any medical flags from previous postings. It's not glamorous work, but it keeps people alive, so I take it seriously. Marcus Wen's file was notable before I ever met him. The medical section was the first thing. His biometric history from previous postings showed a trauma and recovery pattern that, taken out of context, would have looked alarming. Multiple high-stress physiological events, the kind of readings that in most species would indicate serious medical history. But the annotations from his previous medical officers were consistent. Subject shows accelerated recovery, no lasting physiological impairment, psychological profile stable. I had processed human files before. I knew humans had a reputation in certain departments: the Xenobiological Team, the Combat Readiness Assessment Division, for producing numbers that didn't fit neatly into standard species matrices. But Wen's file was, even by human standards, notable. The second thing I noticed was his personal equipment authorization request. Every trainee was permitted a small allowance of personal equipment beyond the standard issue kit. Most people used it for comfort items, a communication device for contacting family, a specific grooming product their species required, a piece of culturally significant jewelry they wore in off hours. A few combat veterans used it for lucky charms or unit memorabilia. Marcus Wen's personal equipment authorization listed: 1-1 insulated metal food container 1.2 liters, personal. 1-1 folding utensil set human standard. 1-1 additional water container 0.8 liters sealed. Various food preparation items listed as field ration supplements. I remember looking at this list and thinking, this person is very concerned about eating. Which turned out to be exactly correct and exactly relevant. I processed his authorization without comment. It was all within parameters, and moved on to the next file. But I found myself thinking about it again later, after the incident, when I was trying to understand what I'd actually watched happen. He'd packed a lunch. He'd packed a lunch to bring to Deathworld training. Not metaphorically, literally. He had submitted a formal equipment authorization for the specific purpose of having a meal ready and waiting when he came out the other side. I'm still not entirely sure what to do with that. Witness account: Cadet Fen Alarak, Solthari Light Division, intake batch 7741. Recorded interview, 9 months post-incident. I'm going to tell you what I personally observed. I'm not going to speculate about what it means, because honestly, I've been speculating since it happened, and I haven't gotten anywhere useful. The night before the Deathworld circuit runs, there was a gathering in the common area. Not organized, just the natural thing that happens when a large group of people are facing the same frightening event the next morning. People cluster. People talk. People seek reassurance or distraction or community, depending on their species and their temperament. Most of batch 7741 was there. We were spread across the seating areas in the rough groupings that had naturally formed over the intake week, species clusters, mostly, though with some crossover where individuals had made connections that overrode the social gravity of shared biology. Marcus Wen was there, sitting on a low bench near the external viewport. He had the insulated container in his lap. He was doing something with it, checking the seal, adjusting the temperature lock. I couldn't tell exactly from across the room, but it was methodical. Whatever he was doing it carefully. A Vreth cadet named Gorox, big, loud, the kind of person who occupies a room before their body technically arrives in it, walked over and asked what he was doing. Wen looked up. He said he was packing his lunch for tomorrow. There was a pause that I would describe as comprehensively confused. Gorox stared at him, Several people nearby who had heard stopped their conversations to listen. Gorak said something like, "For the circuit." Wen said yes. He said the drag ran long and he got hungry, and the station food after the circuit was always too bland for his taste, so he preferred to bring something from his own supplies. Gorax, and I want to be fair to Gorax here, because Gorax was responding to what was, by any reasonable standard, an extremely unusual statement, said something along the lines of, "You're packing food for after the circuit. You're already planning what you're eating after." Wen considered this for a moment, as if checking whether that was an accurate description of what he'd said. Then he said, "Yeah." Gorax laughed. Not mockingly, I want to be clear about that too. Gorax laughed the way you laugh when something has genuinely surprised you and your body needs somewhere to put the surprise. It was confused laughter, almost helpless. Someone else asked Wen if he wasn't worried about tomorrow. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, and I'm quoting as accurately as my memory allows, which I will admit has been sharpened considerably by how many times I've replayed this conversation in my head since he said, "I'm a little worried about the drag. Last time I cramped up around the 2-kilometer mark. I've been hydrating differently this week, so it should be better, but I won't know until I'm in it." And then he went back to checking the container seal. The gathering in the common area continued for another couple of hours, but there was a quality to it afterward that hadn't been there before. A kind of, I don't know exactly how to describe it, not inspiration. Not quite, more like something had been disrupted. The ambient anxiety that had been running through the room like a low current had developed a strange interference pattern. One human, sitting in the corner packing his lunch, mildly worried about cramping. We were all going to the same place tomorrow, and he was packing his lunch. Part 3. The circuit as witnessed by those outside IT. Technical Observer Report. Sub-Officer Marin Dale, Verk 9 Safety Monitoring Division. Official report submission, filed within 72 hours of incident. My role during Deathworld circuit runs is to monitor the biometric feeds from all active trainees and flag any readings that fall outside the medical safety parameters. The safety parameters are generous by design. The circuit is supposed to be hard, and discomfort readings are expected to be high, but there are threshold levels at which intervention protocols are triggered. My job is to watch the numbers and call the intervention if it happens. I have been doing this job for 9 cycles. I have overseen 412 circuit runs. I will describe what the biometric feeds showed me during Wen's run, and I want to note that I have reviewed this data multiple times since the incident, and I have not found any errors in the recording. The first gravity shift chamber produced elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and stress hormone readings consistent with significant physical exertion. These were high readings, high even for his species, but within the documented human physiological range. His blood oxygen levels dropped in the reduced atmosphere zones and recovered within acceptable parameters. His temperature regulation readings showed sustained effort in the temperature corridors, which was expected and normal. Up to this point, the feed looked like a hard but manageable run. High numbers, but numbers I recognized. The psychological pressure sequences are where things became unusual. The sequences use individualized triggers drawn from the trainee's intake assessment to produce genuine stress responses. For most trainees, this is where the numbers spike hardest. Fear response data, combined with environmental stress, produces readings that sometimes approach the edges of our intervention parameters. Wen's fear response readings during the psychological sequences were present. He was not unaffected. I want to be clear about this because I have seen the incident summary reported in ways that suggest he experienced nothing, and that is not accurate. He was stressed. His cortisol readings elevated sharply in the enclosed space simulation in Sequence 2. His heart rate spiked during the pursuit protocol. But the duration of each spike was notably short, and the recovery curve after each one was, I have looked at human physiological literature since, and I believe the correct term is remarkable. Not the stress response itself, that was normal. The recovery from it, the speed at which his system restabilized. Stress recovery continue. Over and over, through 9 hours of the circuit. The drag, the final section, is where most trainees who are going to fall. The cumulative stress of everything preceding it combines with the physical demands of a weighted run in heavy gravity, and it is simply too much for the body to maintain. Wen's readings during the drag were the most interesting of the entire run. They were high. Don't misunderstand, they were high. Heart rate near his documented maximum, oxygen levels at the lower end of acceptable, physical strain indicators in the red bands of the monitoring system. But they were, and I am going to use a word that I don't normally use in official reports because I cannot think of a more accurate one, steady. High and steady. Not climbing toward the intervention thresholds, not spiking and crashing. Just held there at a level that should not have been sustainable for 2.4 kilometers and sustained. He completed the drag at the 2.1 kilometer mark. 2 kilometers in, his biometrics suggested, well, they suggested a person running very hard in very difficult conditions. The cramp hit at exactly 2.1 kilometers as he had predicted. I could see it in the readings, a sudden change in his movement data, a corresponding jump in the pain response indicators. He slowed for approximately 40 seconds. Then he continued at a reduced pace and completed the remaining 300 meters. I checked the clock when the exit gate sensor registered his completion. His total circuit time was 9 hours, 51 minutes, above average, not a record. He was the first of batch 7741 to complete it. The second completion came in at 11 hours, 7 minutes. 5 trainees in batch 7741 did not complete on the first attempt. I filed my standard report. Numbers, times, observations. I noted the stable recovery curve and flagged it for the xenobiological documentation team per standard procedure for notable human physiological data. And then I pulled up the external camera feed to do my standard post-circuit wellness visual check. Specialist Wen had sat down in the dirt outside the exit gate. He had taken the insulated container out of his pack. He was eating. Witness account, Senior Instructor Kelvanthar, Verk 9 Training Division, Lead Instructor Batch 7741. Recorded statement, 11 months post-incident. I've been running training batches at Verk 9 for 14 cycles. I have seen a lot of things. I want to start with that context because I think it's relevant to how I'm going to describe my reaction to what I saw that day. I watched the post-circuit monitoring feed as a matter of routine. When the first trainee exits the Deathworld circuit, there's usually a standard pattern. They come through the gate. They stand or sit for a moment. Medical drones do an initial wellness scan. The trainee is escorted or walks, depending on their condition, to the medical bay for post-circuit evaluation. The medical drones deployed as Wen came through the gate, standard procedure. They approached. He waved them off. Not dismissively, he looked at them, held up a hand in what was apparently a gesture of reassurance in human culture, and said something that the audio feed recorded as, "I'm okay. I'll come by the bay in a bit. I just want to eat first." The drones are not equipped to argue. They have a wellness scan protocol. He wasn't in the critical parameters that would trigger override, so they stayed within proximity but didn't advance. He sat down in the dirt, right there, outside the gate on the ground. He took the container out of his pack. He opened it. Steam came out, which meant whatever was in there had maintained temperature through a 9-hour circuit in environments ranging from -41 to +67 Celsius, which told me something about the container itself. He took out his folding utensils. And he ate. I'm going to describe what happened in the next 20 minutes, because I think the details matter. He ate slowly, not rushed, not the desperate, mechanical calorie loading you see from trainees who have burned themselves out and are trying to survive the recovery. That looks different. That looks like someone trying to keep themselves alive by force of will and simple biology. This was measured, deliberate, like a person who had sat down to eat because they were ready to eat and were going to take their time about it. 2 other trainees came through the gate during that 20 minutes, both Silthari completing together in a team configuration. They came through and nearly fell. The medical drones caught one of them. The other made it to the wall and leaned against it, chest heaving, eyes closed. Neither of them acknowledged when immediately because they were in no condition to acknowledge anything. But after a few minutes, one of them, Cadet Alarak, who I believe has given you a statement, looked over and processed what she was seeing. I watched her look at Wen, look at the container, look at Wen again. Wen glanced up, noticed her looking, and offered her the container. I could not hear what he said from the monitoring station, but the audio log captured it. You want some? I brought enough for 2. Cadet Alaric stared at him for a moment. Then she made a sound that, on review of the footage with the species behavior consultants, we identified as Silthari involuntary amusement, the equivalent of stunned laughter. She shook her head, Wen shrugged and went back to eating. I sat in the monitoring station for the full 22 minutes that he ate. I have thought about why I couldn't look away, and I think it's because there was something happening in that image that I didn't have a framework for yet. The contrast. The gate he'd just come through, I know what's on the other side of that gate. I've sent enough people through it. I know what it costs them. And here was this human, sitting in the dirt, eating what turned out to be a rice-based dish with what the lab later identified as several complex protein compounds, in no apparent hurry to be anywhere other than exactly where he was. He finished. He sealed the container. He stood up, not with effort, which surprised me. Most people who have done the circuit can't get up off the ground without visible strain for hours afterward. He stood up, brushed the dirt off the back of his pants, picked up his pack, and walked toward the medical bay. The medical evaluation found him within normal parameters. Slightly elevated inflammatory markers, some muscle fatigue indicators consistent with heavy exertion. Nothing requiring treatment beyond standard rest protocols. He asked the medical officer if he could have a refill on his water container. She gave it to him. He thanked her and left. Part 4, Reaction, the ripple through batch 7741. Witness account, Cadet Irvin Salax continued. I came through the circuit exit gate at the 11-hour, 40-minute mark. I will not describe the experience in detail, partly because this account is already long and partly because I am not entirely convinced I have words in any of my available languages that would do it justice. It was the hardest thing I have done in my life. I am not ashamed of that. I believe it was designed to be the hardest thing most people who go through it have done in their lives. When I came through the gate, I was not in a good state. The medical drones got to me immediately. I sat on the ground outside the gate because my legs stopped working approximately 3 seconds after I cleared the threshold, which I was later told is extremely common and nothing to be concerned about. I sat in the dirt. And I became aware slowly through the fog of extreme physical exhaustion that there was something in front of me, a smell, a warm smell, complex and layered, and food. It was food, but not the station food which has a particular character I will politely describe as functional. This was something that smelled like someone had put thought into it. I looked up. Wen was sitting about 4 meters from me. He had apparently returned to the same spot outside the gate after the medical bay. He was sharing food with 2 other trainees who had come through while I was still in the final stretch. One of the Vreth cadets, Gorox, the loud one from the night before, had his massive hands wrapped around what I later learned was a thermos of broth, drinking from it with an expression that I can only describe as confused gratitude. Wen had, apparently, brought enough food for multiple people. This detail, when I had the cognitive capacity to process it, rearranged something in my understanding of what I'd been watching. He hadn't just packed his lunch. He had, at some level, packed for the possibility of sharing. Whether he'd planned it or simply brought excess out of habit or some instinct about what the people around him might need after 9+ hours of the crucible, I don't know. I've never asked him directly, but he'd brought enough. I watched this for a while from my position in the dirt. Gorox, who is enormous and terrifying and had gone through the circuit making sounds that I'm fairly sure could be heard on the station's outer hull, was sitting cross-legged in the dirt next to a human who was a third his mass, drinking broth from a borrowed container with an expression like someone had handed him a lifeline. The medical drones kept circling. Trainees kept coming through the gate in various states of structural integrity. Some of them got food. Some of them were too far gone and just got medical attention. But Wen stayed there for, I don't know how long exactly, a long time. Long enough that Instructor Vanthar eventually came out from the monitoring station to check what was happening. I remember watching Instructor Vanthar approach, and I remember the look on his face when he processed the scene. He stopped a few meters away, stood there, looked at the sitting figures, the containers, the steam and the cold air outside the gate. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he turned around and went back inside. Witness account, Cadet Gorox, Vreth Heavy Infantry Division, Intake Batch 7741. Recorded interview, translation assisted by Vreth language specialists. You want me to talk about the food? Yes. I will talk about the food. I came through the gate and I will be honest with you, because there is no point in being otherwise, I was not well. The circuit broke me in 3 places that I had not expected. The psychological sequences used information about my family that I did not know they had, and it was effective. I will say that. It was effective. I came through the gate, and I saw Wen sitting in the dirt. I had been thinking about Wen during the psychological sequences, strangely, not because of anything complicated, just because of what he had said in the common area the night before about the cramp and the hydration, the specificity of it, the practicality. While the sequence was doing what it was designed to do to my perception and my emotional state, some part of my brain was thinking about a human who had specifically analyzed where he was likely to cramp during the final stretch and had adjusted his hydration in the preceding week to try to address it. When I saw him sitting there eating, I was not angry. I want to be clear. Some people have described a type of irritation or resentment at seeing someone apparently unaffected by something that has just destroyed you, and I understand that, but that is not what I felt. What I felt was something I cannot entirely name in galactic standard. In Vreth, we have a word, veshkaral, which roughly translates to the feeling of discovering that a thing is different than the shape of the hole it fills in your understanding. It's used for encounters with the sacred, with the very old, with things that turn out to matter more or differently than you expected. I sat down in the dirt next to him, and he handed me the thermos and said it would help with the recovery, something about sodium and electrolytes in the broth, and I drank it, and it was the best thing I had tasted in I don't know how long. We sat there in the dirt together. I am 1.4 times his height and more than twice his mass, and I am from a species with reinforced skeletal plating and redundant cardiac organs. He is from a species that, by the numbers, should not be in the Deathworld classification at all. We sat in the dirt together and he gave me broth, and we didn't say much, and I thought about veshkaral, and I thought that maybe the shape of the hole I'd had for human, in my understanding, had been wrong this whole time. Part 5, what it meant, the conversation afterward. Witness account, Senior Instructor Kel Vanthar continued. The evening after the circuit, when enough of batch 7741 had recovered enough to be ambulatory and coherent, there was a debrief session. Standard procedure. Trainees process what they experienced. Instructors note any critical gaps in preparation or protocol. Medical team flags any follow-up concerns. The debrief was not standard. The reason the debrief was not standard was because the first question that came up, before I had even fully established the format, was from Cadet Alaric, who looked directly at Wen and said, "How?" Not "how did you complete it?" Not "how are you not in the medical bay?" Just "how?" Wen took a moment. He seemed to be deciding how to answer a question that had not been entirely specified. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "The circuit is long. Long things have a shape. The first part is the worst because your body is still arguing with what's happening to it. The middle part is where most people make mistakes because they think they should be done by now and they're not. And that gap between expectation and reality is where people lose it psychologically. The last part is just, you know you're going to finish, so you finish." Alaric looked at him. "The drag, you had a cramp at 2.1 kilometers. He said yes. She said, "How did you?" And then she stopped because I think she was having trouble finishing the sentence. He said, "I slowed down, then I sped up again." She said, "But the cramp." He said, "Yeah, it hurt, but I only had 300 meters left." There was a silence in the room, not an uncomfortable silence, more absorptive, like the room needed a moment to process. Gorox from the back said in his deep, slightly overloud voice, "You brought enough food for 5 people." Wen said he'd brought extra because he wasn't sure what would be available afterward. Gorox said, "You plan for after." Wen said he always planned for after. I don't think Gorox meant it as a philosophical observation, but it landed like one. He always planned for after. For a room full of people who had spent 9 to 11 hours in an environment specifically designed to dismantle the assumption that there would be an after, that hit somewhere real. I let the debrief run longer than I normally would have. The conversation kept going, kept finding new corners to turn, kept pulling in people who hadn't been planning to speak. There was something being worked out in that room that I hadn't encountered in 14 cycles of running debrief sessions, and I didn't want to interrupt it. Near the end, a cadet from the Choron batch, a species known for their formal, precise communication style, not given to casual philosophical musing, said to Wen, "In our tradition, the quality you've demonstrated today would be called Velmarith. Endurance that is also presence. To go through a thing and remain fully here in yourself, rather than becoming the thing that is happening to you." Wen looked at him for a moment. Then he said he'd never heard it described that way, but that it felt about right. The Choron cadet nodded. That was how the debrief ended. Part 6, the second attempt 3 days later. Internal Memorandum, Training Division, Verk 9, Senior Instructor Vanthar to Station Commander. Filed Cycle 4409.8, 3 days post-incident. Commander Seelith. I am submitting this memorandum to document an informal development that has occurred in batch 7741, following the Deathworld circuit run on cycle 4409.77. 3 days post-circuit, 6 trainees who completed on their first attempt, and 1 who did not, have independently indicated their intention to request an additional circuit run within the current intake period. This is unusual. Repeat runs within a single intake period are permitted but rare. The standard recovery time recommendation discourages it, and most trainees who complete once have no particular motivation to repeat the experience. Of the 7 who have requested additional runs, all 7 have cited, in various phrasing and with varying degrees of directness, some version of I want to understand what Specialist Wen did differently as part of their motivation. Cadet Solek stated it most directly in his request submission. I completed the circuit. I don't know how. I want to complete it again, but this time I want to understand what I'm doing while I'm doing it. Specialist Wen seems to understand what he's doing. I want to learn to do that. Cadet Gorok submitted a request with a single line. Again, but this time I bring food. I am approving all requests. I note this for the record because I believe the behavioral shift in this batch, the move from "how do I survive this" to "how do I understand this," is pedagogically significant and may be worth documenting for future training program development. I also note for the record that when I informed Specialist Wen that 6 other trainees were planning to repeat the circuit partly based on his example, his response was, "That's up to them. I tell them to sleep more than I did before the first run. I was a little short on sleep, and it made the psychological sequences harder." I am still thinking about how to categorize that response. Respectfully, Senior Instructor Kel Vanthar. Part 7. The Longer View. What the Archive concludes. Analysis Section. Senior Archivist Thesson Vorel, GDC Historical Documentation Unit. I have spent 3 years with this file. I want to be honest about that, because 3 years is longer than I spend with most files. Most files get processed, cataloged, cross-referenced, and shelved within a few months. This one kept asking me to come back to it. I'm still not entirely sure why, except that something in it keeps opening new angles every time I think I've found the last one. What happened on cycle 4409.77 at Crucible Station, Verk 9 was, on the surface, a straightforward instance of a trained human specialist completing a difficult training circuit. This happens regularly. Humans are classified as Deathworld species. Their performance on high-stress military training is documented, and while it remains impressive on a species comparison basis, it is no longer surprising to anyone in the field. What is documented in this file is not the completion of the circuit. It is the lunch. More specifically, it is what the lunch meant to every non-human witness who observed it. I have tried to analyze this from multiple angles, and I keep arriving at the same core observation. The lunch was not remarkable because of what it was. It was remarkable because of when it was, and what it meant that someone could do it at that particular time. The Deathworld circuit is, by design, an experience of sustained extremity. You are pushed to the edges of what your body and mind can sustain continuously for 9 to 11 hours, in an environment that exists for no other purpose than to find where your limits are and push against them. Every species that goes through it is changed by it in some form. The change is, in most cases, a recalibration of their understanding of their own capacity, a productive change, which is why the training exists. But it is still a change. Something happens to you in there, and you come out the other side carrying it. Marcus Wen came out the other side and ate his lunch. This is not to say he was unchanged. The biometric data in this file is clear that he experienced real, significant physiological and psychological stress during the circuit. He was not impervious. He was not unaffected. He was, and I am going to use Cadet Alarak's translation of the Quran word here, because it is the most precise description I have found present. Through whatever the circuit did to him, he remained himself, not a version of himself that the experience had temporarily remade, himself. And when himself came through the other side, himself was a little tired and a little hungry and had planned for that, so himself sat down and ate. The witnesses in this file did not react to his performance in the circuit. Several of them, in fact, don't describe watching his performance at all. They were in their own circuit runs during his. They reacted to what came after, to the evidence of a mind that had been through something hard and had, on some fundamental level, already metabolized it before the exit gate even closed behind him. In my experience of 4 decades of archival work in military and training contexts, I have encountered many different models of resilience. Species with redundant biological systems, species with collective stress-sharing mechanisms, species with deeply ingrained cultural frameworks for processing trauma. What I have not often encountered, and what this file documents with unusual clarity, is a being who had apparently internalized, at such a deep level that it no longer required conscious management, the expectation that hard things would be survivable, not just intellectually, somatically, reflexively, in the body's own planning horizon. He packed his lunch before he went in. He knew he would be hungry when he came out. He was right. To every non-human witness in this file, that was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the most remarkable thing that happened that day. More remarkable than the biometric data, more remarkable than the completion time, more remarkable than the recovery curve. He planned for after. And after happened exactly the way he'd planned for it too. Part 8, the subject's own words, partial interview transcript. Interview conducted by Archivist Vorel, GDC Archive Unit, Cycle 4411.22. Note, Specialist Wen agreed to this interview on the condition that it be noted he doesn't think it's that interesting. That condition is noted. Archivist Vorel, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Specialist Wen, sure. I still think this is kind of overblown, but sure. Archivist Vorel, I want to ask about the lunch. I've been working with this file for some time, and I want to understand your thinking behind it. Specialist Wen, there's not a lot of thinking to it. I get hungry. The circuit runs long. Station food after is fine, it's fine, but I had stuff I actually wanted to eat, so I brought it. Archivist Vorel, did you consider that you might not complete the circuit, or complete it in a condition where eating would not be a priority? Specialist Wen, pause. I mean, sure, that's possible, but I was going to try to complete it, and if I did, I'd want food, so I brought food. Archivist Vorel, how did you decide how much to bring? Specialist Wen, another pause. I don't know, I brought more than I'd need. Habit, I guess, figured someone might want some. Archivist Vorel, did you anticipate that your manner of recovery would have an effect on the other trainees? Specialist Wen, no, I was just eating. Archivist Vorel, the witnesses in this file use words like Velmarith, Veshkarul. The Silthari trainee described it as one of the most affecting things she'd seen in a military context. The Krathai trainee changed his entire approach to training based on what he observed. I'm trying to understand if you were aware of any of this at the time. Specialist Wen, long pause. People were tired. When people are tired and things are hard, they're open, I think, to things that help. I wasn't trying to demonstrate anything. I was just being where I was. Archivist Vorel, being where you were. Specialist Wen, yeah. Archivist Vorel, can you say more about that? Specialist Wen, thinking. The circuit is designed to make you not be where you are. That's kind of the point, right? To put you somewhere so intense that you lose track of the bigger picture. You're in the moment of the thing that's happening to you, not in your own life that exists before and after the thing. And I think I've done this enough times. I think the trick is to not let the thing eat the before and after. To know, while you're in it, that you were somewhere before you got here and you'll be somewhere after. The lunch it's a physical version of that. It's a thing in the after that I was holding onto while I was in the during. Archivist Vorel, a way of keeping the after real. Specialist Wen, yeah, that's probably a better way to say it. Archivist Vorel, where did you learn that? Specialist Wen, he considered this for a long time. I don't know, Earth, I guess. Earth kind of teaches it. When you grow up somewhere that routinely tries to kill you, you either get eaten by it or you figure out how to keep the after real. Keep tomorrow real, even when today is a lot. Archivist Vorel, you're referring to your planet of origin. Specialist when Earth has been trying to kill humans for 200,000 years. We're still here. We figured out something along the way. I don't know if I can name it exactly, but yeah. The lunch is part of it. Archivist VOREL. Is there anything you want people to take from this account? Specialist when long pause. He seemed genuinely uncertain. I don't know. Don't overcomplicate it, maybe. You're going to get through hard things. Pack for the other side. When you get there, eat your lunch. End of interview transcript. Part 9. Aftermath where they went. Closing documentation. Archive Unit GDC, Cycle 4412. The members of Batch 7741 completed their intake period at Crucible Station Verk 9 and dispersed to postings across 7 different GDC member systems. What follows is a brief accounting of selected individuals, documented for the record. Cadet Irvin Salax completed the Deathworld circuit on his second attempt, 11 days after his first completion. His time improved by 43 minutes. He noted in his post-run report that he had identified the psychological sequence triggers that had been most effective against him on the first run, and had worked with his assigned counselor to make the gap between the during and the after smaller. He went on to a career in GDC tactical planning, and has been cited twice for leadership under sustained pressure conditions. He keeps, according to people who know him, a small meal packed and ready on deployment. Cadet Gorox completed a second circuit run 8 days post-original. He brought what the medical team described, in their post-run wellness check, as an implausible amount of food, in a pack that he had apparently modified to increase capacity. He shared it with everyone who came through the gate during his post-run waiting period. This became a Batch 7741 tradition. The phrase "Gorox brought enough" entered informal usage in the unit as an expression meaning that someone had prepared generously beyond their own needs. Cadet Fen Alaric went on to become a senior trainer in the Silthari Light Division's Mental Resilience Program. She has published 2 training papers in the GDC Military Psychology Journal, both referencing a concept she identifies as holding the after real, a phrase she attributes, in the footnotes, to an unnamed human specialist whose behavior at a training facility changed her understanding of what resilience looked like in practice. Specialist Marcus Wen was redeployed to an active duty post in Sector 14 Omega approximately 2 months after the Verk 9 intake period. His service record over the subsequent 3 years is classified at a tier above what this archive unit has clearance to access. The portions available to us are consistent with his established profile. He does his job. He does it well. He doesn't appear to need much fanfare about it. His equipment authorization for his subsequent posting included, per the logistics records available to this unit: 1-1 insulated metal food container 1.2 liters, personal. 1-1 folding utensil set human standard. 1-1 additional water container 0.8 liters sealed. Various food preparation items listed as field ration supplements. He packed his lunch. Again. Archivist's closing note. Senior Archivist Thesson Vorel, GDC Historical Documentation Unit, Cycle 4412. I have, over the course of working with this file, been asked several times what I think the lesson of it is. Colleagues in the documentation unit, trainees who have heard the story secondhand and tracked down the source, a lieutenant commander in the GDC Intelligence Division who contacted me after the file was cited in a xenobiological research paper on human psychological profiles. They all want the lesson, the point, the takeaway. I have stopped trying to reduce it to one. What I believe this file documents is something that resists reduction. It is not a story about a superhuman. The biometric data is explicit. Marcus Wen hurt during the circuit. He cramped. He experienced stress and fear and physical extremity. He was not immune to the crucible. Nobody is immune to the crucible. That's not the story. The story is about what he did with it. The story is about a mind that had learned, somewhere in 200,000 years of evolutionary pressure, on a planet that never stopped trying to end its own creatures, to keep one hand reaching forward into the after, even while the rest of it was fully occupied with the during. The story is about the difference between being changed by hard things and being consumed by them. The story is about the lunch. It always comes back to the lunch. 11 species sent representatives through the Deathworld circuit on cycle 4409.77. Every one of them was affected. Every one of them came out the other side carrying something, some recalibration, some new data about themselves, some scar or some broadened capacity or some combination of both. One of them came out and ate his lunch in the dirt. One of them had packed for the other side. One of them already knew he was going to get there. I have been doing this work for 42 cycles. I have archived heroism, tragedy, and everything in between. I have never written a closing note before that I felt comfortable ending with a line borrowed from the subject himself. But he gave me the line, and I cannot improve on it. Don't overcomplicate it. You're going to get through hard things. Pack for the other side. When you get there, eat your lunch.